Welcome back. Let's continue our deep dive into sentence structure, focusing on all the different techniques that are available under that umbrella term. We're going to focus in particular for this video on questions. Now, I thought about calling this video rhetorical questions because that's quite often the answer that candidates give, but actually it's more complicated than that. There are really three types of questions that you can talk about under sentence structure for National 5, and I want you to be familiar with all three so that you choose the right one and don't always jump for a rhetorical question. So let's have a look. When you see a big question mark like this, you know it's a question. Okay, you've been using question marks since very, very early in primary school. You know, and when it's lit up like this, it's very, very obvious we're talking about questions. However, in a big text that's, dozens of lines long, hundreds of words, many paragraphs, the question marks start to get a little bit lost. They start to get harder to see, and when you're stressed and reading under exam conditions, you can miss them. It's very easy to miss them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the three types of questions, and I'm going to show you some examples as well, so that you get better at seeing the question marks and then analysing what types of questions they appear at the end of. So let's have a look at the first type. The first type is the basic, the writer uses a question. Now this is a question immediately followed by an answer, and I'll show you an example of this later in the video. So the writer uses a question followed by an answer. This is where the writer gives you the answer. The second type is our old favourite. The writer uses a rhetorical question, and we'll deal with that in detail too. And the third type is when the writer uses a series of questions. Now if you think of series, think of Netflix or TV programs that you watch on Netflix where there's a series where maybe there's 10 or 12 episodes. So those 10 or 12 episodes are in a series. The same way questions, if there's more than one, can be in a series as well. And we'll look at an example of that. So three types: question and answer, rhetorical question, and series of questions. Let's look at the first one. The writer uses a question and then, crucially, answers the question themselves. So he or she answers the question. Look at this short passage. Climate change is a global issue. Can we afford to ignore it? Absolutely not. The threat to life on this planet is too great to ignore. So here's our question. So if we were scanning through for our question mark, we would have seen it there after the word it. And you might jump there to saying the writer uses a rhetorical question. But this question is not rhetorical. Why? Because the writer has answered it themselves. It's not leaving the answer up in the air. It's not leaving it up to the reader to think about the answer. The answer is given by the writer. Okay, so this is just a straightforward question with an answer. Now, let's look at the second type. A rhetorical question is one asked in order to create a dramatic effect or to make a point, rather than to get an answer. So in this case, the answer isn't important. It's what's implied in the question. Let's look at an example. Climate change is a global issue. Our planet is getting hotter and hotter every year. The polar ice caps are melting. Severe storms and hurricanes are increasing in frequency. What's worse is we know how to stop climate change, but don't. How long will we allow this madness to continue? Now, can you spot the question? Yeah, it's at the very end of the paragraph. Okay, there it is. Question mark stands out. Now, unless the writer went on to answer it in the next paragraph, we're going to assume here that they don't. This is therefore a rhetorical question. It's kind of left hanging. Now, why would the writer do this? Well, they want you to focus on what's in the question. And for me, two parts of the question stand out here. How long and madness. So the madness is this idea that our behaviour towards allowing climate change to happen is madness, that we're crazy, that humans are a bit insane letting this happen. And the how long is basically this idea that too long has passed already, too much time has passed already, we need to act quickly. And that's a really good rhetorical question there. And now let's look at the third type of question. The third type is a series. So a series of questions is a number of questions in a row. Okay, it's almost like a list of questions, but they're not bullet pointed. They appear one sentence after another. And here we get to see an example. Climate change is a global issue. It is getting worse and nobody seems to be taking any responsibility for the problem. How much longer will governments continue to burn fossil fuels? When will people stop using cars for short trips? When will we make the changes to our lifestyles that will save our planet? So you may have seen the first question there, and this is the risky point for me. This is the point where a lot of people go, oh, there's a question. I'm going to say the writer uses a rhetorical question. And I suppose technically you're right, because there's no answer given here. But actually, the SQA would probably view this as a series of 1, 2, 3 questions. Okay, and it's easier to see them if I add color to them. So the yellow, green, and light blue there. So this is a series of questions. There's 3 questions in a row. You could call it 3 rhetorical questions in a row, I suppose, but it's just easier to call it a series of questions. Okay, when you see a question mark in a passage, you have to decide which of the 3 question types you're looking at. Are you looking at a question with an answer? So you need to look at the next sentence to make these decisions. Is the next sentence an answer? Is the next sentence another question? Or does the next sentence move on? If the next question is an answer, then it's a straightforward question. If the writer moves on to a different topic, then it's a rhetorical question. But if it's followed by another question, you're probably in a series of questions. Okay, let's look at some worked examples. Before we do that, by using one of the question types, the writer is saying, please pay attention to this point as it's an important part of my argument. This is why any of the techniques are used. So the writer is saying, this question and answer, or this rhetorical question, or this series of question is asking you to look at a particular point that I'm making, or that he or she, the writer, is making. So remember, it's the writer shining the light with the technique. Okay, and here come the examples. Right, first up, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic will soon offer people the chance to pay for a ticket into space. While many Scots holiday abroad in places like Spain, France and Italy, we've never had the chance to holiday in outer space before. Soon it will be a reality. Virgin Galactic will charge £190,000 for a ticket to journey into space on board one of his spaceships. Who can afford a ticket though? So, change of topic, we're moving away from climate change. This is into space travel or space tourism. And if we're looking at a question, it would look something like this. Look at lines 1 to 9. Explain how one example of the writer's use of sentence structure makes it clear that space travel still isn't easy for 2 marks. Now, there are a few techniques in there. I can already see a list: Spain, France and Italy. Word choice, if you're looking outside sentence structure, could be there as well. But we are focusing on sentence structure, and we're looking particularly at question types. So if you look carefully, you can see the question there at the bottom. Who can afford a ticket though? So we now need to decide which of the 3 types this is. So we need to look after the question mark into the next paragraph. So if the next paragraph had another question, it might be a series. If it had an answer, it'd be an answer. But in this case, we're going to assume that the next paragraph just moves on, right, to a different part of the argument. In that case, we've got your classic rhetorical question. And the answer will look like this. The writer uses a rhetorical question in line 9, 1 mark for that part. And for the second mark, to emphasize that tickets to travel to space will be very expensive and few people will have enough money to buy a ticket. So our analysis focuses on what the question asks us to do. Okay, we don't just write whatever analysis we want, we focus on the question. And on to a second example. Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic will soon offer people the chance to a ticket into space for £190,000. Who can afford that price tag? Who would spend that much money on a trip that lasts a few hours rather than a house that lasts a lifetime? Should anybody be able to blow that much money on a space adventure when so many people are starving in the world? Now, in this case, the question is, look at lines 1 to 9, explain how one example of the writer's use of sentence structure makes it clear that space travel is still a luxury. So we have to focus in on this idea of a luxury. So what's a luxury? Well, it's something that few people can afford, something that's very expensive, that you only buy every now and again, so you would get it in your weekly shopping. Right, back to the passage. So here, you probably saw a question mark right at the top. Who can afford that price tag? Now, we need to look after the question mark. That's the trick here. If what comes after is an answer, it's a question and answer. If nothing really comes after it linked to it, then it's a rhetorical question. But in this case, we can see it's followed by 2 more questions. And I've highlighted the 3 question marks in yellow to make it easier for you to see. So this is clearly a series of questions. So to answer the question, we say the writer uses a series of questions or a series of rhetorical questions, but it's important to get the word series in there, in lines 3 to 9, to emphasize that the tickets are too expensive for most people. So this is showing that it's a luxury. The trip is quite short considering the price, and there is worthier endeavours to spend our money on, like world hunger, that was mentioned, showing that space travel is a luxury that only rich people can enjoy. So I've tried to get the main ideas of the question, that idea of luxury, in there as much as possible. and that would get me my 2 marks. The main takeaway from this video is that you need to remember that there are 3 question types. The writer uses a question, followed by an answer. The writer uses a rhetorical question because it has no answer. Or there's more than one question, in which case the writer uses a series of questions. Okay? So if you take that away from this video, I'd be delighted, the idea that it's not just all about rhetorical questions, that there are 3 types of questions. Okay? And we remember that any technique, and in this case question types, are used by the writer to draw your attention, to shine a light on a certain part of their argument, and that's what the question will ask you to focus in on. So our formula is identify the type of question, question and answer, rhetorical question or series of questions, quote that question, and then explain why the writer used that particular type of question, and focus on the wording of the exam question to help you dig into what the writer is saying and their main point. So remembering it's only one of many sentence structure techniques, the question will ask you to write a sentence structure, but you'll have to pick off of the list. Sentence structure is not a technique. I know I'm repeating myself here, but beware, beware, beware. Never write the writer uses sentence structure. You're always going to write the writer uses a rhetorical question, or the writer uses a short sentence, or the writer uses a list, or the writer uses repetition. I know you get the idea by now. Okay, and I'll see you in the next section.